마하무니 Good evening, dear brothers and sisters. A very warm welcome to our Vesak special Dhamma talk series, Compassion in Action, Peace and Non-Violence in Buddhism. Tonight, we are very privileged to have Ajahn Jayasaro here with us to talk about the Buddhist perspectives on peace and non-violence. So can we actually use force for the sake of peace? Buddhism has widely been perceived as a religion of peace and compassion. And in fact, the Buddha condemns violence in every form. The ongoing war in Russia and Ukraine has affected many people and torn many families apart. And we mustn't forget about the civil war in Yemen, the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts, the border disputes between India and China, etc. All these have sparked many different opinions and emotions amongst us. So the question I asked myself before the session today is that how do we actually realign ourselves with the teachings of the Buddha? So Ajahn Jayasaro is one of Thailand's most renowned Buddhist monks and meditation masters, and we are very, very privileged to have Ajahn here with us today. If all of us can join our palms together to pay respect to Ajahn. Good evening, Ajahn. Let us begin. I'll start with my first question. So how this is going to work is that me and I'll be interacting with Ajahn and asking some questions, but just some housekeeping rules before we start is that I hope that you all can remain muted throughout the sessions. But if you do have any questions, you can type into the chat or you can type it into the Facebook or the YouTube comments, and then we can ask on behalf to Ajahn. So my first question is that, Ajahn, can anger be a positive emotion, and can violence be a positive action?
Short answer, no and no. I'll expand on that. So anger is an emotion that is always, in every case, based upon ignorance. It's an emotion that arises from ignorance of the way things are. So in a clear vision of the way things are, there is no possibility for anger to arise. The anger is based upon the idea of self and others, and as practice develops, the boundaries between self and others change, become more fluid, and are no longer solid enough to sustain anger in any form. In Western culture, then there has long been a debate on the possibility of anger as a positive emotion, and the idea of righteous indignation has played a part in theology and in general debates, and is in the mainstream of the culture. And the idea that we see today is that in the face of overwhelming odds, overwhelming injustice, in which people feel helpless, vulnerable, without power, that anger is the only emotion that will sustain any prolonged opposition to injustice and cruelty. So anger as a motivating force for those who are faced with almost hopeless odds or overwhelming cruelty. That idea is, I think, generally accepted, and the idea that there are some kinds of anger that you should hold on to, that they are valuable, and that without that anger, you would become prey to despair. So anger as an antidote to despair, I think that idea is quite widely accepted. I wouldn't accept it myself from what I understand to be the Buddhist position. The fueling your anger, feeding your anger, cultivating your anger for whatever reason that they are is valuable. Ultimately self-destructive. And without that anger, the angry mind is a very coarse mind. From angry mind sees things in terms of right and wrong, black and white, us and them. And so will almost inevitably simplify what are, in almost every occasion, complex situations. Situations that have arisen through a web of causes and conditions, and that the angry mind is unable to tease apart, to investigate the causes and conditions of violence and oppression, and to deal with them wisely. It's like a big hammer approach. It's not in any way a subtle or nuanced approach, and one which recognizes what can be done, what can't be done, what needs to be done short-term, long-term, and so on and so forth. And the angry mind is one which will very easily compromise on one's moral standards and ideals. And before long, then, the distinction between the right side and the wrong side gets lost, because if you once you accept the possibility of acting immorally for a moral objective, then you'll find that your opponents probably are working on the same assumption. They might seem to you to be completely immoral, but in their own eyes, they are probably believe themselves to be acting morally. And this same idea of acting immorally for ultimately moral results is the root cause of the longevity of so many conflicts around the world. So I would say that as far as the second part of the question, and turning to violence, and is violence acceptable, then I would say that from the standpoint of the suttas and the teachings of the Lord Buddha, it's quite clear there can be absolutely no justification for violence. It is always bad karma to act violently, because the intention is key to karma. And if the intention is to hurt or to harm, then karma is created. Nevertheless, the question that I think is sometimes overlooked is to say, well, what does it mean to be a Buddhist nation or to be a Buddhist individual? And for most householders, then they have multiple identities. This is to say, they have identity as a Buddhist, but also identity as a subject of a country, they have identity as parents or as children, as spouses, as mothers, fathers, etc. And that it's not the case that at every moment of the day, their Buddhist identity is the primary identity. And in many situations where there is a danger to family or a danger to the integrity of a country, then for even householders who identify with, if you were to ask them what religion do you profess, they would write on a form that they're Buddhist, but their identity as being a Malaysian or a Thai or an English person would take precedence, would take priority over that, or their identity as being a mother or a father who has to protect their children would take precedence over their Buddhist identity. So I did a little poll of some of the lay Buddhists that I know, my students, and put that question to them, just how absolutely pacifist they would be if there were threats to their country or to their family. And these are genuine and committed lay Buddhists, but they would admit that if there was that kind of threat, then they would be willing to compromise on the first precept. And I think this is kind of normal for householders because they have not made that total commitment to the threefold training that a monastic has. So certainly it's clear cut for a monastic, you would die rather than commit an act of violence, and that's part of the commitment you make, the renunciation you make to become a monastic. But there's a recognition that that kind of standard is not one that most people are ready to make. So as a monastic, you're not saying, well, it's all right. Yeah, I understand your position, and therefore, because you're committing violence in a good cause, it's okay. I mean, it's bad karma, but the role of the monastic, as I see it, is to remind people of the Dharma principles. But at the end of the day, every individual has to make their choice. And in some cases, lay Buddhists will make the choice to say, well, I don't feel that I can keep that precept right now. And, as a monastic, you say, well, you're not a Buddhist anymore, kick you out of Buddhism. So recognize the conflicts that lay Buddhists face in the world.
Can I just ask this actually leads me to ask the next question, but before I thought I asked it, I would like to know, because just now Ajahn was saying that we shouldn't really use anger as a fuel to our helplessness or situation, but as the disciple of the Buddha, how should we feel ourselves when we are faced with injustice?
Well, Buddhism has a very profound, subtle teachings on motivation and wholesome and unwholesome motivation. And we distinguish unwholesome motivation or craving or tanha from wholesome motivation, which is called chanda, or sometimes dhamma chanda or kusala chanda, but for short, we just usually use chanda. And that distinction is often completely misunderstood or overlooked in Western treatments of Buddhism, particularly of unsympathetic representations of Buddhism, where the idea is that Buddhism teaches that we shouldn't desire anything, that desire is bad, and if you desire anything, you're you suffer, therefore you should try to find a state of no desire. But that's quite a serious misrepresentation of the Buddha's teaching. The Buddha said that we replace tanha, craving, the unwholesome motivation, with the wholesome motivation. And for instance, in the teaching of the paths to success, what we call the 4 iddhipadas, Chanda is the first of the 4 iddhipadas, and it leads to virya, or effort. So there is a clear link being drawn between the cultivation of Chanda, wholesome motivation, and effective effort. So Chanda is distinguished by the focus on the action itself rather than on the result of the action. Unwholesome desire is focused on the reward or the result rather than the means by which that result is obtained. So for instance, someone working motivated by tanha would be primarily motivated by the desire for wealth, for status, for power. Whereas someone working primarily motivated by chanda would be concerned with doing the best job they can, enjoying their work, developing their skills in their work. And so the focus is on the means rather than the end. So there is always going to be a need for motivation, but the idea is to channel as much as we can into the wholesome stream of chanda and as little as possible into tanha. So motivating oneself with anger is definitely on the side of tanha. It's unwise motivation. Whereas chanda is recognizing something that needs to be done, and one's motivation is to do what we can do as best we can given our circumstances. So it's on that sense of I'm doing what I can, I'm doing the best I can. That's where you find your energy and your motivation. Rather than saying, yes, sorry. Okay.
I was just going to lead on to my next question. Is that so? What can we do? There are two angles to this sort of question. Is that as a citizen and as a leader, what can we actually? Because we've talked about religion, the identity, the intention as well. But what can we do as a citizen or as a leader when our country is oppressed or treated with violence? Because I feel like there's a bit of dilemma here, because if we fight back, it goes against the teaching of ahimsa or the non-violence. But then if we don't fight back when people invade our country, in a way we are passively encouraging violence on the other hand. So I just wanted to ask Ajahn, is there any practical advice that, or is there a better way that we can uproot the problem?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. First of all, I think probably the formulation of Buddhist approach on a national or state level would probably be in line with the United Nations resolutions, in which force is considered to be the last resort and only legitimate in the case of self-defense. I think that would be probably the position that most lay Buddhists would hold to. in positions of power and influence. The Buddhist teachings were originally referred to by the Buddha himself, either as the brahmacharya, particularly when speaking with monastics, or else to the Dhamma Vinaya. So we often, everyone's familiar with talking about the Dhamma, but not so much with Vinaya. And the assumption is usually made that Vinaya refers to the monastic code, the rules, regulations, protocols, customs, and so on, that by which the monastics live their life. But there is a wider, more comprehensive meaning of this term, Vinaya. And it means really creating the external conditions which are most conducive to the practice and realization and propagation of Dhamma. So that includes laws, regulations, agreements, protocols, customs, which all strengthen and facilitate the practice of Buddhism, or in this case, the preservation of peace between nations. So Buddhism is not at all a teaching which is exclusively focused on the individual and on the individual's state of mind, but does recognize the importance of the environment, the importance of the social environment, political environment, and that it's taken to be responsibility of leaders to be creating structures which facilitate the peaceful coexistence of nations or of communities within nations, and to minimize the possibility of conflict. So in the example you gave, it's like that's when things have already reached the critical stage in which there's no way out. But from Buddhist point of view, we're saying we need to put a lot of more effort into finding ways of preventing that situation ever occurring in the first place. But having said that, there is a profound asymmetry between the actions of good, kind, moral people and the actions of cruel, immoral people. And an example I often give is that if we had 100 people sitting in a room and we want peace, we want quiet, all 100 people would have to participate. Whereas if we wanted noise and disturbance, only one of the 100 wouldn't be necessary. And if we want to have peaceful coexistence between 100 families in a village, you only need to have one family of criminals and completely immoral people to disturb the peace of a village. And in a world community, you see, I don't think that it's true that the majority of people are cruel and selfish and so on, but those that have a disproportionate impact on the well-being of the majority. And that's why I can't see that there will ever be anything we could say world peace. And just from that simple fact that even if you were to reduce the power and the influence and the number of immoral people or people who wish to act immorally, you're always going to have a problem because they have a disproportionate effect on the majority.
So in a way, you're saying that the peace between people and the countries, they might not be achievable. Is that what you mean, Ajahn? Or?
Well, I don't think that peace is achievable, but I think that working for peace and creating as much peace as we can is the goal that we should work for. But there's never been peace, I don't think, in the world ever. There's no reason why it's suddenly going to appear now. But there have been major advances made. If you look at which is the most violent and lawless and cruel part of the world until very recently is Europe. European people are always fighting each other in a very cruel and nasty way. But since the Second World War, there's been no conflict, not on a state level, because of the creation of a community of nations, of the EU. So from that, whatever its drawbacks or its weaknesses on political, social, economic angles, then I'm not an expert on those. But from the simple point of making a huge change in the safety and the well-being of European people, it's done a fantastic job. So we can improve things, but I don't think that it's possible that we say, we can develop world peace and that should be our goal, and then frustrated that we can't make it, because I don't think it's an attainable goal. But I'm reminded of the Mahayana Bodhisattva vows. You say, like, all sentient beings are without number, but I will save them all. That's the kind of attitude. Yeah, maybe we can't really expect a world without wars and without conflicts, but we can do our best to minimize them and to learn what are the causes and conditions that minimize and reduce the severity of conflicts, and how can we put those structures into place. So that's the Vinaya side, and then of course there's the Dhamma side in terms of the education process given by the Buddha himself. But frankly speaking, there's always, even in Buddhist nations, there's always only going to be a minority of people who are really going to make a serious commitment to that training.
Just to, because we talk about how we should be preventing conflicts from happening. That just because my question is that how do you think we should spend our national budgets to better prevent future conflicts and violences? Just give a context. Imagine that all the world leaders are here with us today. What advice would you give in terms of how we should spend our budget to better prevent conflicts and violences from happening?
Yeah, I'm getting out of my sphere of expertise here into giving advice to a collection of world leaders, but I think that we can't ever change anybody. So let's get down to basic principles. One person can't change another person, but we can give them the reasons and the inspiration and the confidence to change themselves. So that's the role of a teacher. A teacher can't change a student, but the teacher can facilitate and help the student to help themselves. And I would assume this would be the same principle, whether it's speaking to people in a monastery or people in the United Nations or whatever. Is like, what exactly is our goal here? what do we want? And I would think that most world leaders would say want the well-being of their people. So let's look into that. So how can we create the causes and conditions for maximum well-being in the world today? I think that there is a place to talk about ultimate principles, because in most decision-making bodies, I think they tend to be very short-term. Like a democratic government has its eye on the next election, and so is almost compelled to think short-term, because if you put in a long-term program, which just means short-term pain for long-term gain, very few democratically elected governments are willing to do that, because they'll get kicked out of government when the people are enduring the pain, and then their opponents will receive the fruits when all the good results come. So this is just inherent in the democratic system of government. So there are always difficulties or there's a particular way of looking at things when short-term goals are the norm. And that's why there has to be, I think, a stage in which we can talk about values and ideals and long-term gains. Okay, we know maybe leaders of a country know what they would like their country to be, where they'd like it to be in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. But if we say, what do you think about 100 years' time? Where do you see your country in 100 years' time or 500 years' time? And of course, then your whole focus has to change, because you can't be talking about material things and economic production, but when you get into long-term focus, you have to talk about values. And I think there's not enough talk about values, I would say, and I would encourage these leaders every now and again just to talk about values rather than their narrow, short-term self-interest.
And can you expand a bit more about the type of values that we should be actively discussing about, Ajahn?
Well, start off with basic Buddhist observation. We're all subject to old age, sickness, and death. We're companions in birth, old age, sickness, and death. And it's very difficult to talk about this without resorting to cliches, but the things that unite us are far more numerous, far more profound than the things that divide us, and finding the links and the connections rather than emphasizing the differences. I mean, I think it's shocking that after all the development and the technological developments, I mean, the technology that allows us to speak in this way right now, and yet such a huge number of people in the world are caught up in prejudice based on color and gender, and this is like the sort of ABC of civilization. It's like that we're still on that level of discriminating on someone just the way that they look or the color of their skin. I mean, it's absolutely pathetic, isn't it? I mean, it's unbelievable that in the same civilizations that can create so much wonderful art and science, and that people could be caught up on just what color skin they are. So these are things that really need to talk about a bit more. how can we allow this to? We don't allow it, and there's a lot of discussion about it, isn't it? But we're not doing very well on the very basic elements of humane coexistence. So I would just think that it is surely uncontroversial that feeling safe is something that everybody desires, that living with people who are kind to you and being able to be kind to other people is superior to people treating each other cruelly and with selfishness. I mean, maybe just establish that. I mean, kindness is superior to cruelty. And just start off with basics, because we can't even seem to get those things down very well at the moment.
Thank you, Ajahn. I'm just curious here is that because we know that if we all always have the nature towards awakening and compassion, why do we always react with anger and violences instead of wisdom and compassion? Is there anything, at least on a personal level, that we can do day to day so that we can align ourselves back to our Buddha nature?
Well, as human beings, our gift is our capacity to learn and our capacity to change. But our human nature is to a large degree animal nature. We have just the ordinary animal needs for food and rest and sex and all these different drives. That's part of being human. And they're very strong drives. So without a training and without a systematic education of all our faculties, then our default reaction to all the challenges of life is the instinctual, what we call the defiled reaction. So it's unless you've been trained, I think it's obvious that it's easier to be unmindful than it is to be mindful. I mean, nobody just is born mindful and just finds it easy. Mindfulness is something to be achieved through training and education, and goodness and kindness. We will have capacity for those virtues, but they need to be raised up as goals. They need to be praised, and they need to be taught to children, and then they need to be systematically developed. They need to be integrated into education systems. So it's easier to be angry than it is to let go of anger. It's easy to be greedy than it is to let go of greed. But we can be free of anger. We can reduce our anger. We can reduce our greed. But it's work. And the question is, how much are you willing to put into that work?
Is there any practical examples that Ajahn can give us, that sort of what day to day we can do, for example, to cultivate towards that side of our nature, if you like?
Well, I think that the four aspects of right effort that we find in the Eightfold Path are extremely practical and flexible. So the first effort is to take care of our mind in such a way that as yet unarisen, unwholesome mental states will not arise. And then secondly, in the cases where they do arise, then making the effort to abandon, to let go of them, and then making the effort to introduce into the mind, to instill in the mind the wholesome mental states that have not yet arisen, and fourthly, to take care of and to further cultivate those wholesome states that have already arisen. So wherever you are, whether you're alone or whether you're with family or you're at work or you're traveling, there's always opportunity for one of those four kinds of at least one of those four kinds of right effort. And the mindfulness in daily life that we need, it's not like a floating quality of awareness. You always have to be mindful of something. And the most fundamental objects for mindfulness in daily life are the 5 precepts. So you are mindful of the precepts. It's not that you keep the precepts as a prerequisite for the practice of mindfulness and Dhamma practice on higher levels, but keeping the precepts is your Dhamma practice in daily life, and being mindful and remembering them and being able to recall them on those occasions where you are tempted or pressured into transgressing them.
Just to change the angle a little bit, Ajahn. So if I understand correctly, there's 2 levels of the Buddha's teaching. There's the ultimate and the relative reality. But in the ultimate level, the Buddha taught us to transcend duality. But then in the relative sense, we do need to differentiate between the good and the bad. So how do we actually apply the wisdom of non-dualism when we are approaching social or economic or political injustice? Is there any practical lessons we can learn from the Buddha himself?
Well, I think observation, constant observation of experience is the key. Constant observation allows us to see how wholesome motivation can, if we're not careful, become unwholesome motivation, or an unwholesome motivation become wholesome motivation. Let's say, for instance, you join a charitable foundation or some kind of activist group and devoted to the betterment of society, but after a while you become attached to the power that you might have in that group, or you become very attached to your opinions and being able to impose your opinions on other people, and all kinds of ways in which are basically selfless and noble intention can be corrupted through lack of self-knowledge and lack of self-awareness. And we can see this in groups of people devoted to good in society, often full of disharmony and jealousies and egotism. So something can start off very well and can change into something not so good. Otherwise, some people can, in Thailand, there have been a time where meditation became very fashionable again after a long time, and people going on meditation retreats simply because it's kind of cool thing to do. But then after a few days on a meditation retreat, then they suddenly realize, oh, this is really something truly valuable. And so the rather trivial intention becomes a good intention and becomes a wholesome intention. So seeing how people's intentions, people can change, and how I think that observing yourself and observing defilements in your own mind very clearly makes you sensitive to them in other people, and being able to see, oh yes, that person's suffering from that same defilement as me, and seeing that that's where the unity comes from. Yeah, it's not like that person's acting in a very obnoxious way, and it's a kind of a personal thing, but it's like that arrogance, let's say, is like a virus, and I've got that virus. Every now I've had that virus myself, and that person's got that virus. So you're seeing things in terms of wholesome and unwholesome dhammas manifesting in people's behavior, and because presumably you're not an arahant yourself, you're saying, oh yeah, I have that as well, and so there's a humility that arises from that, and a sense of fellowship, and not creating this strong sense of us and them. So there is on the conventional level, let's say you're in a position of authority and someone is misbehaving or someone is dishonest, then you have to act appropriately, and it might even mean to sack that person if they're, as a last resort. But at the same time, you have a recognition, oh, that person's just got caught up in that particular defilement. They were carried away. And so you have that compassion and sense of recognition of what's really going on here. But on the conventional level, then sometimes somebody has to be punished or in some way, or even has to be sacked from their position if there's no other remedy. So I think I'm just trying to come up with some examples where you're holding the two things together. You're not creating this strong self, I'm good and that person's bad. And the Buddha, in fact, in the Majjhima Nikaya, talks about the wise person and the fool, and gives a number of examples. And he says, if you keep the 5 precepts purely, but on the basis of that, you consider yourself superior to someone who doesn't keep the 5 precepts, then you're a fool. You're not a wise person. So your precepts are no longer pure because you take them as grounds for arrogance or considering yourself superior to others. So there are many of these reminders, but I think I would stress the importance of this observation of what's going on in your own body and mind, what's going on around you, and the more centered you are, the more grounded you are in the present moment, then the more you learn, and that dissolution or the strong sense of self and others starts to fade or to be dissolved by that awareness.
In the suttas, so in Is there any examples that the Buddha himself has approached any injustice that we can learn from, Ajahn? Or
an injustice, like
sort of how the Buddha himself has approached any injustice in the past that we can learn from for now in our modern society.
You mean like a personal injustice, or
or how he has solved or approached any, during his time, any injustice?
Well, in the monastic discipline, then there are various categories of rules, and transgression of the more minor categories, rules within the more minor categories can be resolved through confession before the fortnightly recitation of the Patimokkha. If a monk commits what's called a Sanghati Sesa offense, then there is a period of penance and before rehabilitation. And if a monk acts in a way that breaks one of the 4 parajika offenses, then he has to leave the Sangha and cannot reordain as a monk in this lifetime. So in terms of transgressions and misbehavior amongst the Sangha, and this is in an environment which the Buddha designed himself, so it's kind of an ideal community, then there's the idea of taking responsibility, non-concealment of offenses, and having committed an offense, then making the commitment to refrain from such action in the future. And misbehavior certain amongst the Sangha, and this is in a severe or gross, the monk is given the chance to make a fresh start by going on a period of penance with special practices, refrain from such action in the future. But when certain actions rehabilitated, and gives the community at large a sense that there is recognition by going on a period of penance with special practices to amend it. But then if someone goes beyond the boundaries of what's acceptable for a samana, then that's the end. He has to leave. So there is that kind of strictness and or absolute kind of decision making. So, a monk who, if we consider the Buddha as like ocean-like compassion with no boundary at all, and yet if a monk commits one of the 4 defeat or parajika offenses, he's not forgiven in the sense that he can come back and become a monk again. I mean, he's forgiven in the Buddha doesn't hold a grudge against him, obviously, but that he's forfeited his right in this lifetime to live in this way. So on a personal, so that's how the Buddha's seeing it on a social level, but in terms of the Buddha himself, then there is the quote, the passage where the Buddha says that his feeling towards Rahula, his son, is exactly the same as his feeling towards Devadatta. So there's no difference in his feeling. So there's that absolute refusal to make distinctions between human beings, that no matter their conduct or their behavior towards the Buddha in the past, then his feeling towards them is unaltered, unalterable. And so that's the goal, so the Buddha is like our exemplar, and that's the standard that one tries to move towards as a Buddhist.
Thank you, Ajahn. I'm just a bit conscious of time, and there are multiple questions that has flown in. So I thought I will start asking the questions from the floor, and if you can address them, please. So the first question is, so dear Tan Ajahn, can you please share some teachings on giving and loving? It's easy to give to those we love, but not so to those we disagree with. How can we bridge the divide between the two?
Sorry, what was the beginning of the question?
So just it's like, can you share some teachings on giving and loving? Because it's giving and loving, because it's very easy to give to the people that we love, but then on the other side, it's a bit more difficult. And how can we actually bridge the division between the two?
Well, that is the goal of practice, and giving and sharing is the fundamental way of bridging the gap between oneself and others. Interestingly, the can't remember his name now. It's an American statesman who had a very inveterate enemy in the Congress or the Senate. So I can't remember the details of this story, but this man was a great lover of books, and so it might be Stuart Mill or someone like that. And so he asked his enemy whether he could borrow a book from him. He'd heard he had this particular book, and he was very keen to read it. And so this man gave him the book to read, and that was the beginning of their reconciliation. Because once you've given something to somebody, you can't look on them in the same way anymore. And that person, that enemy of his, once he'd given him a book and shared it, he couldn't sustain that same level of anger and hatred. So giving is a very profound thing. It's an activity. It's like a fundamental Buddhist practice, and it's a practice which gives rise to what in modern day we would call self-esteem, because when you give something, you automatically become a giver. And that understanding of yourself is, I am a giver, means I am somebody with something to give. And that's the basis of self-respect, that being someone who has something to give and someone who does give. So undermining or working on this sense of liking this person or not liking that person is giving is a very good way to start. But the practice of the Brahma Viharas of metta, where you start off with metta for yourself, and then you light a little flame, and then you take care of that, and you expand to the people that you love and people that you care for, and then to the neutral people, and then to finally to people you don't get on with. So this is the inner way of changing your attitude to people around you.
Thank you, Ajahn. I will move on to the second question. So can Ajahn kindly comment on why there is so much violence in Buddhist countries like Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Thailand? What would be the role of the Buddhist Sangha in these countries, and also the lay Buddhist communities?
Well, I don't know that there is a lot of violence in those countries. All I know is what you read and hear in the media, and I'm very skeptical. There may be, may not be. I really don't know. So I'm not taking it as a given that the premise of this question is correct. But as I mentioned before, human beings are human beings, and their religious affiliation doesn't always enter into their calculations when they act, and particularly if they are not practicing the Eightfold Path and not learning how to be mindful of their actions of body, speech, and mind. They're not committed to precepts. They're not committed to this training. Then it doesn't seem strange to me at all that they should act violently on occasion. I would say in Thailand that the tolerance for people of other religious persuasions or of other different is probably I would say, unrivaled anywhere in the world. It's absolutely incredible. And until there is admittedly problems in the south of Thailand, there's insurgency and there is violence. But I would doubt very much whether the Thai Buddhists who act immorally or violently are doing so in the name of Buddhism at all. It's not a Buddhist Muslim conflict in the eyes of most Thais. So in those kinds of situation, there isn't that sense of religious conflict. Like Buddhism not being a religion based upon belief in dogmas has never rejected other religions or sought to get rid of them or to convert people who belong to minority religions. There is, at least in Thai Buddhism, this recognition, well, yeah, you have different beliefs, you have different ideas, but if you're a good person, then you'll go to heaven. That's the kind of basic kind of village Buddhist belief, that it's how you act, how you behave to others, how you live your life that decides what happens after you die, not what religion you belong to. And this is this can be borne out by the lack of persecution of religious minorities in Thailand throughout history. And if you compare with 16th, 17th, 18th, even 18th century Europe, the contrast is a stark one. And I think it's one of the proudest achievements of Buddhist societies in particularly in Thailand, that there's never been that kind of religious persecution, because it's alien to the whole way of Buddhist culture and understanding. But there are ethnic and political conflicts, and there are economic conflicts, and sometimes they are characterized as religious conflicts, and I'm not sure that that's always the case. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So this isn't such a clear answer, maybe, but I would say, first of all, that it's very important that we always remind ourselves that we don't really know what's going on. I mean, I've been a Buddhist monk in Thailand for over 40 years, and I still feel I have a very limited view. of what goes on, because I try to keep very strictly to what I know as a direct experience. And I think that in the last 10 years, there was a general feeling in the West that Buddhism's had a kind of an easy ride, that people were idealizing Buddhism as a religion of peace and comparing it unfavorably with Christianity and Islam. And there was a bit of a kind of a backlash, and a lot of articles written and books written, well, you know, these Buddhists, they're supposed to be so peaceful, but did you know that it's really like this and like that? So I'm a bit skeptical about that and the intentions behind that whole wave of articles and the stuff that came out. So I'm not meaning in any way to gloss over things that happen with Rohingya people or in Sri Lanka. I'm sure that there are things going on there, but these are complex phenomena, I would say, and the people who live on. I was born on an island, so I feel I'm qualified to say people who are born on islands are a little bit weird. There's a specific kind of psychology for people who live on islands, and so I'm making a comment about Sri Lanka here. You know, there's sort of the some of the conflicts there. This is like island people conflicts. Yeah, I don't feel I'm an expert enough to make any really qualified, authoritative comments about what's happening in Buddhist countries, but I would say that it's very difficult. You have to be really, ingenious to find some backing in Buddhist scriptures to justify any kind of violence.
So do I understand correctly that, Ajahn, so even if our intention is to defend the Dharma, we shouldn't resort to using like violence or force? Is that right?
I'm not saying should or shouldn't. I mean, it's quite clear that if you act violently, then you're creating bad karma. So it's up to you. Do you want to create bad karma or not? There's to be, it results in suffering, but that's your choice.
Okay. There's another question is that as a lay person, how can I stay open-minded, kind, and compassionate when witnessing ignorance of those who are in power to sufferings of people and brutal oppression of those who do not share the same political views?
First thing, don't watch the news so much. These days, if you're looking at your screen many times during the day and you're seeing all these distressing things that upset and depress you, fill you with anger and helplessness, and the question is, why? Why do that? If you want to keep in touch with what's happening, that's your responsibility as a citizen. I would agree that's a good reason to look at an update or a summary of news once a day for a few minutes. But the question is, why looking at things and listening to things throughout the day? You know, what exactly is the purpose behind that? It's not giving you any more knowledge or understanding of what's going on or any ideas about what can be done about it. It's just upsetting you unnecessarily. So I'd say that I'm not saying turn off all the news and don't take any notice of what's going on. That's not what I'm saying, but saying, ask yourself, how much news should I watch in a day? What's the optimum amount that I need to watch, and what are my viewing habits? So all media is skewed, is prejudiced to one degree or not or other. It's not going to be completely objective. So you are opening yourself to the perspectives and prejudices of others at the same time when you watch, listen to news. So being aware of that as well. But again, it's a matter of spending a little more time meditating and reflecting and developing that mindfulness, and then openness and compassion. They don't come about through an act of will. It's not, you can't just decide to be open-minded or compassionate. But these qualities grow naturally when the mind is cultivated in line with the Eightfold Path. And the connections and the ability to feel compassion for people who are on the other side of the divide, or if you take a side in a war, then there's incredible amount of suffering and distress on the other side as well. It's not just a one-sided thing. And being able to recognize that. You say if there's any kind of dispute or conflict in society on whatever grounds, then it's really good practice to try to find out who is the most articulate and intelligent representative of the view that you disagree with, and then listen to them or read them and see what they have to say. Try to expose yourself to opinions that you disagree with every now and again, and perspectives that you're not familiar with, so that you avoid that tendency just to always be listening to people who have the same idea as you do.
I think I've asked all the questions from the floor, but if I've missed any, please type in your question into the chat box. But may I just please ask one last question from myself, at least, Ajahn. What can we Buddhists as a community offer to the world?
Well, I don't know whether there is such a thing as a Buddhist community throughout the world, but I would say that common sense, kindness, and the ability to listen to all sides of an argument, and to not to be carried away by our emotions, but to recognize emotion as emotion and thought as thought. This is the Buddhist insight. The body is the body, feelings are feelings, perceptions are perceptions, thoughts are thoughts, consciousness is consciousness. We are all companions in birth, old age, sickness and death. No one wants to suffer. Everyone wants to be happy. We have these basic truths of human experience that are verifiable, and I think it is generally acknowledged throughout the world that in Buddhism we have some very effective practical techniques for working with the mind, and sharing those would be mindfulness practices and loving kindness practices, forgiveness practices, and so on. So I'm not sure that there is like a stage on which the Buddhist community can share this, but I think we all have our own individual world, our own society, our own group of family and friends, and to try to embody the Buddhist values in our own conduct and in the way that we talk about the world and the way in which we think about the world, and just to be as good example as you can be in your own small world.
There is a question that just came as we talk. Dear Luang Por, I heard that people are often not aware of violences we do to ourselves. Can you please comment on that?
Violence to
ourselves.
Violence to ourselves, yeah. From the this is not just like a metaphor or a way of speech, because there are people who are committing all kinds of violence against their bodies these days, and that can be from committing suicide or attempting to commit suicide. There are huge numbers of young people these days who cut themselves, particularly young girls. There are people who are destroying their health through various kinds of drugs. These are all acts of violence against oneself and one's well-being. But the trying to deal with your own problems and weaknesses by just saying you should be this and you shouldn't be that and you're a bad person because you think like that and you do like, so that kind of really judgmental, nasty way of looking at yourself is a form of violence. So there can be the crude and physical kinds of violence through physical harming and drugs, or through this very sort of judgmental attitude towards oneself that many people adopt. So these kind of violence are foolish and don't lead to any lasting resolution. So in terms of someone who is very critical of themselves because of things they've done in the past, for instance, or feel very guilty about them, then I would say consider, if you say, I shouldn't have done this or I should have done that in the past, and why did I do this and why did I do that? I'm such a bad person. Then I would say that the reflection is, well, on that particular day, on that particular occasion, you had so much defilement in your mind and so much Dhamma in your mind. The defilement was more than the Dhamma, and so you did a stupid thing. It doesn't mean that you are a bad person. It just means that you need to reduce the amount of defilement in your mind and increase the amount of Dhamma in your mind to prevent that happening again. So don't create this person, this bad person. There's no bad person that you can find. There are foolish actions, and those foolish actions can be abandoned, and you can act in a better way in the future. So you don't have to sort of be violent with yourself in terms of judging yourself and telling yourself you're a bad person. It's all causes and conditions, and through practice of Buddha's Eightfold Path, you can find a way out of even the worst maze and the deepest depression, but you have to commit yourself to it.
So someone else asked that the Lord Buddha said that people fight each other because of sense desires. Can you please give us a short reflection on the link between violence and sense desire? Thank you.
Well, when you want something, then you're immediately suffering, because wanting something is suffering. And your attitude to other people changes immediately, because other people are going to want the same kind of things that you want. So you're going to start looking at people either as competitors or else as prey, some people that you can take advantage of. So the mind becomes coarse and competitive when desire takes over the mind, and there's a fear that you're not going to be able to get what you want to get, and you begin to give an excessive value to the thing that you want. It seems to become incredibly important, more important than anything else. And gaining the object of desire becomes so important that you become willing to compromise on your morality and your treatment of others, and being even willing to commit acts of violence. So when the fulfillment of sense desires becomes central to your life and your sense of self-worth and meaning in life, then you're on the path to conflict and violence for sure.
Thank you so much, Ajahn, for tonight's teaching. And I think we all now are quite clear on the Buddhist perspectives on peace and non-violence. And tomorrow night, we'll have Ajahn Kalyano, who is the abbot of the Buddha Bodhivana Monastery in Melbourne, to tell us all about the Buddhist approaches to social reconciliation and healing. Before we end, can we please ask Ajahn to lead us all in the dedication of merits, please? Thank you.
Which chant should Imina, or there are different chants?
Sorry?
Shall I give a blessing?
Yeah, could do.
I give a blessing. Yatha varivaha pura paripurenti sagarang evami vaito tinang petanang upakapati Jitang batitang dumhang kipamiwa samichato sapphe purentu sankapa janto panaraso yatha manijotiraso yatha sapitio eva janto sabharoko vinasato matem vatvantarayo sukhi thikayuko phava Apivadana silesa nityang utha pachahino Jataro thamma vatanti ayuvano sukhang phalang.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Sadhu. Thank you so much to everyone. And let us all join our palms together again to pay our respect to Ajahn. And I hope everyone has a good evening. And thank you. Okay.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma